So on behalf of all panelists, let me first express our deep gratitude to His Royal Highness Prince Harazi for his patronage and Reverend Dr. Mitri for his initiative and leadership. We will have 5 presentations in this panel, although one of the panelists, Dr. Olaf Fugse-Tveit, could not make it to Jordan, but his paper will be read by Bishop Atle Sommerfeld anyway, so all papers will be read. And the rules are the same as yesterday, so 10 minutes per paper. I will give a 1-minute warning, and when the 10 minutes are over, I will stop you with necessary amount of violence if needed. So, without further ado, I give the floor to Göran Gunnar from Sweden.
Good morning, everyone. I look forward to see the violence from our chairperson. What about Christian Zionism in Sweden that, according to the World Cultural Map, scores top in secular values and self-expression values, up at the top to the right? I will give 2 reflections, one about social media and one about political parties in relation to Christian Zionism. But first, in a study 10 years ago, together with Maria Lepekari, looking into home pages in Swedish claiming to be biblical motivated Christian Zionism, or if you use the language from yesterday, using the myth of Christian Zionism. The conclusion was that the prevailing notion of Christian Zionism was having an existential appreciation for the state of Israel, and the common character was blessing Israel. Let's see if I can get this working now. Yeah, here we go. Bless Israel, even if they could differ significantly when making geopolitical interpretations and speculations. Traditional doom scenarios connected to Armageddon was dimmed and replaced by blessing Israel theology. Messages appear as, "We bless Israel, the Lord bless you and keep you, Israel." This is the most outspoken way of Christian Zionism and the support of the state of Israel, even if it's rather limited in number in Sweden. A big majority of Christians and denominations will argue for ceasefire, international law, including human rights, and so on. Now to my first short reflection concerning social media. And we heard about it yesterday and got a question from Bishop Yunan about use of media. The independent Swedish Media Academy, in a yearly mapping of influences in the digital media landscape in Sweden, showed trust in media, politics, and business. And one category is religious power holders reaching out in Sweden. And in the category YouTube, the daily paper, the word today, is in 2nd place. The paper described itself as an independent newspaper and a strong supporter of the state of Israel and Christian Zionism. And the text below, the Jews have a unique key role and God wants us to bless them. Then we ourselves also will be blessed. And that's a little bit surprised to find this as one of the main religious voices in YouTube. The same with Lars Enarsson, appearing in the 10th place, posting weekly YouTube messages from Jerusalem. He is independent and argues frequently against other Christian denominations. Why showing all this? Because the amount of posts in social media counts. We have in the bus heard about, and we've got it on the screen, the necessary to use the hashtag for the conference. It's important to replace or give an alternative to Christian Zionist influencers, since they are strong in social media, at least in Sweden. Or from the last session yesterday, to tell counter stories and how to echo our stories. My second question, I will raise the question if the traditional Swedish Christian Zionist voice is replaced by the political party's voice. The Christian Democrats is historically closely connected with the Pentecostal movement, a strong voice for Christian Zionism, at least in the last election. They got 5%. The party claims, for example, to be look at settlements as an obstacle to peace. But what they do is another story. In 2023, 10 MPs from the party traveled on a trip to Israel. Several of the participants were active in different denominations, even a priest of Church of Sweden. And later they submitted motions in the parliament, supported by the party board, and the message is to recognize Jerusalem as the capital of Israel and to move the Swedish embassy to Jerusalem. And in addition, there was a motion dismantling UNRWA and another motion defining BDS as anti-Semitic, and this is in the parliament in Sweden. And they continued in another trip organized by Israel Alliance Foundation. They visited several settlements, and afterwards in the Jerusalem Post it was written, Christian Zionist lawmakers have positioned themselves as a diplomatic iron dome for the Jewish state. And one of them is from the Christian Democrats in Sweden. And the latest proposal is from the European Union Parliament MP, who proposed that in order for immigrants to get citizenship in Sweden, they must recognize Israel's right to exist, as well as has an intention to embrace Judeo-Christian values. And in a blog, the MP targeted the Left Party and pro-Palestinian movements as leftist Nazis. Today, another party is important in Sweden. The party counting Nazi and neo-Nazis among the founder members turned out to be the second largest party in the parliament election last time. And according to the Swedish National Encyclopedia, the party is nationalist with social conservative orientation and described as populist. The party has gradually tried to clear away links to white power movement and neo-Nazism, but it's still popping up. The party today is a support party for the government, and the Christian Democrats are in the government. The Media Academy lists the party as #1 power holder in Swedish social media. And the European Coalition for Israel, with its roots in US Christian Zionism, has published the European Parliament Israel Ranking 2024, based on voting in the EU Parliament. And the Sweden Democrats turn out to be among the top 3 parties in the parliament, voting support for Israel at 95.9%. That's quite a lot. When the Israeli foreign minister blacklisted political parties with Nazi or open anti-Semitic roots, the Sweden Democrats always fell under that category. But nevertheless, representatives from the party traveled to Israel with the aim to be friends with Israel. In article in Jerusalem Post said, Swedish party with Nazi roots wants to be friend of Israel. And we have here to the right the Swedish MP Jomshof, who is chairman of the Parliament's Justice Committee. You heard right, the Parliament's Justice Committee. And he is a Sweden Democrat. And he said, we are pro-Israel. We would like to cooperate with Israel. We want to be friends with Israel. And the text under the photo is, members of the far-right Sweden Democrats are seen amid their mystery-shrouded visit to Israel in Jerusalem. And they had to meet with Israeli Knesset members off record. But in 2024, when the party leader, Jimmy Åkesson, went to Israel, he met, for example, the Diaspora Affairs Minister and the Minister of Culture, discussing establishment of settlements in Gaza. The Swedish morning paper had the headline, Åkesson is satisfied with the trip to Israel, but the country dismissed Sweden Democrats, even if they meet them. Also, one of the members went to prayer breakfast to meet with Jewish settlers, and during many years they had motions to move the embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, but also to recognize Israel's sovereignty over Jerusalem, and urging a total stop to all aid to the Palestinian Authority. The European Coalition for Israel is one of the European organizations with a strong voice in Brussels and European institutions. When introduced, the organization was open with the background in US, with Bridges for Peace, Christian Friends of Israel, Christians for Israel International Christian Embassy in Jerusalem as founding partners. At that time, Haaretz, the paper Haaretz, declared, "The benefit for the Israeli right is clear: increased support for its position within the institutions in the European Union." Today, the organization claims to be a European-based organization and a coalition of Christian organizations from the entire Europe. In an annual conference was organized in Brussels November last year, and in the press release the co-host was the Sweden Democrat, inviting to the parliament. The conference called for an extensive review over EU aid to the Palestinian Authority and asked for a truth commission. So the party with the founding members in the Nazi movement and with a very strong nationalism, anti-Islam and anti-immigration agenda, but with 20% of the voters in Sweden, are doing its best to be Israel's best friends in Sweden, and with the help of the Christian Zionists in our country. And just before leaving Sweden, the Christian Democratic Party leader told that her party was ready to be in government together with the Sweden Democrats. So it looks like Christian Zionism will have an even stronger political further in maybe most secular country in the world, in Sweden. And as a Swede, you do as you are told and stop now. Thank you.
Thank you, Göran, and now I invite Timo Stewart to the podium. Timo comes from Helsinki, Finland.
Thank you. What is Christian Zionism? As you've heard, the debate is still ongoing. There's been a lot of talk about definitions. The debate will never be finished, but that's not a reason not to revisit it. I lift up a definition that I've been using in my work, although it's slightly different to some of the definitions that you're familiar with. It's quite broad, and I think it's important for it to be broad because it encompasses both liberal and conservative Christian Zionism, both political action and the kind of people who will vote for the sort of parties that Göran Gunnar just described in Sweden and also in Finland. We've got a very similar situation, 5% for the Christian Democrats and 20 to 25% now in the polls for the Finns party, which is in government and has a very pro-Israel policy. So the definition I've been using is Christian Zionism is the belief that the Christian Bible contains specific references to Zionism or the State of Israel. So most people would readily agree that, that when the Bible speaks of Egypt, it doesn't have any direct implication for the Arab Republic of Egypt of today. Or when it speaks of Rome, it doesn't really mean the Republic of Italy, even though Rome is the capital of the Republic of Italy. So modern nation states, modern national movements are not directly mentioned in a text that is ancient. Some people make the exception for Israel, and I'd call these people Christian Zionists. They say that Zionism or the State of Israel is directly referenced in the Bible. And this has a lot of implications. Basically, if you say that, you're saying that history follows a predetermined script, a divine script, and that the Bible tells us about it, and we know where things are going. And this is a very particular view of history. It's a closed view of history, it's a predetermined view of history, and ultimately it is a view of history where might makes right. It doesn't focus on morality, values. It focuses on a route that history takes, and we know where it will be arriving. Some Christian Zionists, as we've seen and discussed yesterday, they won't flinch from the moral implications of this. There are some Christian Zionists who are willing to take this to its logical conclusion. If it is God's will that the state of Israel will conquer the land and drive out its people, then it must happen. Some are willing to face up to that. Most are not. Most would rather insist on various fig leaves or try to ignore, cover up, or wiggle out of moral dilemmas. There's a very ancient pilgrimage tradition in the Holy Land of going to places mentioned in the Bible and reading a verse in that place, in ipso loco. And we're here just by the River Jordan. We see the city of Jericho over there. Here's a verse I'll give you that quite often does not get read in this meaning. And they utterly destroyed all that was in the city, both man and woman, young and old, and ox and sheep and ass, with the edge of the sword. That's Jericho. That's from Joshua 6:21. So this is the side of Christian Zionism that's the plunging into the deep end. Very few people go into the deep end, and this is the, I think, speaking as a historian, this is one of the problems of looking at the implications of Christian Zionism for the Gaza war. They don't really, it's hard to imagine how people arrived there. But if you take a longer historical view, it becomes a lot easier because these moral implications are never stressed at the beginning. They're never apparent at the beginning. Yesterday, John Huber said that many Americans are predisposed to support Israel. And that's not because they're genocidal by nature, that's because they've grown up with a story, a great story, as we heard from Gary Burge, about Israel and God's action in the world. And this story has been built up over time. Maybe we need some counter stories, as Asia Martinez was saying. But I'll give you two examples about how this came about in Finland, where, as in America, a very big part of the population is predisposed to support Israel. That's not to say that a large part of the population is necessarily Christian Zionist, but there's a strong predisposition to support Israel, particularly in the past, and that's got to do with how the story of Palestine and Israel has been told. And this will come up in two brief examples. We'll have a look at a few maps and a few people. Yes, here we go. Okay. Very popular European genre in the 19th and 20th centuries. Books about Palestine. Essentially travel books that double as pilgrimage guides, and they work for people who, you know, as the 20th century, early 20th century, 19th century, people who might not ever consider traveling there because it's not feasible. So they want to take an armchair trip into the lands of the Bible, and they read one of these books. So here's an 1862 book, First Finnish Atlas of Palestine, copied from another publication, but anyway. It focuses on the biblical place names and the divisions of biblical tribes, the tribes of Israel. 1926, also a Finnish publication. This is a guide to the Bible, so it's one of the maps that illustrate that. So this is okay. This is something that people would use to understand the Bible better. At the same time, you had other kinds of maps. So just reminding you, because this wouldn't have been obvious to people at the time. On the left, you've got Konda's map from 1889. On the right, there's an Ottoman geography book map. So these maps show Palestine as the rest of the globe would have been shown in atlases. So you have administrative divisions and current cities. So these maps were always around. But this is a 1908 regular atlas from Finland and a 1958 regular atlas from Finland, which show what else? Biblical place names and the divisions of tribal lands as described in the Bible. So if you pick up, if you're living in the early 1900s and you pick up an atlas with, you know, the rest of the maps would be regular countries with the regular borders and the regular cities. And then you flip over to Palestine, and you basically fall into this ahistorical, biblical land which is outside of time and place. And it's as if the people of Israel of the Bible had left the scene, but have had a placeholder for them. And nothing happened since. And nothing could happen since, because this is all that mattered. This transcended reality and geography as we know it. So, if this is regular people reading regular atlases with this kind of a message, then imagine when you hear from the news that there's this national movement called the Zionist movement that is trying to set up a state of Israel as a nation state for the Jewish people in this land, and you look at the map, and this land is actually Israel. Then, you know, makes sense, right? You're predisposed to see this land as nothing else, as a continuation of a biblical story that you're familiar with. That makes a big difference. That makes a very big difference. It means that for somebody to then explain that, look, there are towns that exist that are quite big towns that are not on this map because they're not biblical towns, but actual people live there, and the actual people are not ancient Israelites. In Finnish, by the way, Finnish is one of the few languages where there's no differentiation in the biblical term, like in English you'd read about Israelites in the Old Testament and Israelis in the newspaper. In Finnish, it's Israelis in the Old Testament and in the newspaper. It's the same word. Okay, another point to keep it short, gatekeepers. Finland's not alone in this, but it's definitely been the case that the people who best knew Palestine over the 20th century in Finland, they were Christian missionaries who had moved there, lived years in Palestine, and then moved back. All of them, with one exception, worked with Zionist Jews. And for fear of violence, I'll just leave you with this thought, what sort of message they would have transmitted as gatekeepers of knowledge of Palestine. Not one worked with Palestinians, and this is what Finns heard up until the 1960s. Thank you very much.
Our next speaker comes from Denmark, and his name is Peter Lodberg. You have the podium.
Good morning. I have learned that context matters. My context is the Lutheran Church of Denmark, its theology and ecclesiology. It's a national state church governed by the people through an elected Danish parliament. The context is also that for the first time ever, perhaps, we are challenged, just like the Palestinians, by the idea of manifest destiny, which has come to us from the US and a new president, and his idea of buying, or perhaps even taking by military force, a part of the Danish kingdom called Greenland. Context is also Kai Munk, as we heard yesterday, a pastor who during the German occupation from 1940 to 45 called for resistance and holy rage. He was later killed by the Gestapo. A context that was forgotten after liberation of Denmark in May 1945, but interestingly enough was brought back to us by the South African theologian and activist Alan Bosak from South Africa. Bosak was inspired by exactly the same quotation from Kai Munk in his struggle against apartheid and the struggle for democracy in South Africa, as we heard yesterday. and now I hear it again, now in the context of Palestine. Coming from this context, I have often asked myself, where do we find in our Lutheran tradition that is shared by 70% of the Danish population, the theological resources to understand, to judge, and to act vis-à-vis Christian Zionism that is strong among many Danish people without themselves knowing it? And I have found an answer, or at least I'll try to work out an answer, in the old Lutheran or Reformed concept of status confessionis, which means in this context, Christian Zionism is about right or wrong theology. It is about responsible or irresponsible theology. It is about truth and heresy. Status confessionis was called for in the Lutheran theology when what belongs to God, coram Deo, was substituted by what belongs to the human being, coram hominibus, or said differently, when what belonged to the human being was considered as a source of salvation. In my first slide, I mentioned 3 stages when status confessionis has been called for. The formula of Concordia in the 16th century, only Christ is, as a revelation of God, the only Savior, not the political or religious law, nor the Pope. Dietrich Bonhoeffer, the German theologian, rediscovered the status confessionis in 1933 when he stated that when there is too much or too less law and order in society, there is a status confessionis in order to help the weak and maintain a church based on the gospel and not any foreign principles, like, for instance, the Nazi ideology. And then lastly, the Lutheran World Federation in 1977 in Dar es Salaam, when it agreed on a statement on confessional integrity. Here it is stated, as it is read here on the screen, on the basis of faith and in order to manifest the unity of the church, churches would publicly and unequivocally reject the existing apartheid system. The work on status confessionis in the Lutheran World Federation on criteria for status confessionis have come up with the following criteria. When the gospel is no longer considered the sole necessity for salvation, there is a call for status confessionis. When the life-giving good news is perverted into demands that kill, when the truth of the gospel is no longer expressed in its wholeness, when a church by its conduct or by its concessions to alien norms, especially out of defense to the weak, so loses its credibility that it contradicts the gospel, when it is no longer possible for the gospel to be proclaimed. I consider Christian Zionism as a heresy that calls us to confess the gospel anew, because it gives revelational and salvific meaning to land, political developments, and victory in war. This can be enlarged and broadened, and this I will try to do in my article before April the 1st. Theologically, Christian Zionism represents a modern heresy and presents the church with a confessional challenge. Christian Zionism is not Christian. There are Christian elements in it, but it's not Christianity. Theologically speaking, there is, for instance, or example, no such thing as a biblical right to a land, neither Palestine nor Greenland. It is a political issue. that should be taken care of by the rules coming from international law and the rules of law set up in the international community as the lesson after World War II. Christian Zionism, as far as I see it, meets the 5 criteria for status confessionis. Land and political development are seen as part of God's revelation. Adiaphora becomes salvation. The gospel is a legitimization of warfare. The gospel is not understood in its wholeness. Christian Zionism is a new norm for the church and not the gospel. The gospel is not proclaimed in its fullness. So we have learned this lesson, that international law should be taken care of when it comes to political issues, not theology. And after World War II, we learned the importance of international law because people said in 1948, when the Declaration for Human Rights was established, no more for Jews during the Second World War, no more for everyone. And that is the same today. Human rights are for everybody. Will it help to say that Christian Zionism is not Christianity and perhaps only have elements of Christian biblical thinking and not in accordance with Lutheran understanding of faith? I hope so, and I think so. But we will never know. But we do our best and pray for the rest. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Peter. Now, the paper of Olaf Fuchs' Faith will be read by Bishop Atle Sommerfeld. You have 1 extra minute. Thanks, Peter. I mean, Olaf.
And you push the green one here. Yeah. Yes, I have to, the 1 minute I will use to send you a greeting from presiding Bishop Olaf Fuchs' Faith. He really had medical reason for not arriving. So we can pray for his health, actually, during intercessions. His theme is related to Christian Zionism as a moral and theologically dividing challenge for the churches in Norway. And he is doing, as we have learned in contextual theology, to bring us into the Norwegian context. And then I start reading. After the terror attack on October 7th, and the following devastating war, the polarization of the public discourse in Norway has escalated. In the following, I will try to shed light on how Christian Zionism works as a morally and theologically dividing factor. I question whether one can distinguish a positive Christian Zionism from a negative, and to what degree one can, in practice, fully separate Christian support for political Zionism from a theological Christian Zionism, wherein the Jewish population are made into an instrument in the end times for God's plan for salvation. 3 elements in the Norwegian context. Norway developed close ties with the State of Israel in the 1950s and 60s. The UN General Secretary, by the way, in 47-48 was a Norwegian. Especially this relationship built on the cooperation between the Israeli and Norwegian labor movement. However, during the 50 years, the relation to the Palestinian reality has developed, accentuated by Norway recognizing the state of Palestine in May 2024. The present Norwegian government is strongly involved internationally with diplomatic efforts for a just peace, insisting on the respect for international law, security of the State of Israel, and a two-state solution, and also open access for humanitarian aid and support for UNRWA. In Norway, we also have a strong and broad-based solidarity movement with the Palestinian people. Let me add one sentence. We have an election this coming fall, which may change the policy of Norway more in direction of Sweden, just to say that. So it has been mentioned here. However, accusation of anti-Semitism is common in the public debates, coming from the Israel-friendly media and lobby groups, the Israeli embassy in Oslo, and from some Jewish and Christian spokespersons. The narrative of Israel as a democratic beacon of light in a Muslim authoritarian era is still often heard in the public debate. Secondly, one cannot underestimate how the Holocaust haunts the collective memory of European society, and also in Norway. More than half the Jewish population was killed, largely administrated by Norwegian National Socialists and police. The survivors were only recognized and compensated in 1999. Today, there are around 1,500 Jews in Norway, which makes the Jewish community very vulnerable. Second, the Church of Norway until the Church of Norway until recently, a state church, is the majority church with 63% of the population as members. Around, and now I should probably move here. Around 8% of the population belong to other Christian churches. The close relation between Church of Norway and the Evangelical Lutheran Church of Jordan and the Holy Land has created awareness of the Palestinian people, which is not as visible in other churches in Norway. A new report by a commission appointed by the Bishops' Meeting on the Church of Norway, Judaism and Jews discusses how Christian Zionism is present in the churches. The Commission argues that the Christian Zionism, in line with an American dispensationalist tradition, is marginal in the Church of Norway, and other churches, except in the conservative lay organizations and the Pentecostal and charismatic traditions. In these traditions, the influence from US Christian Zionism and the so-called International Christian Embassy to Jerusalem is quite significant. My analysis, Fixed Faith's analysis, is that most of those who call themselves Christian Zionists are what I will describe as Christian friends of Israel, a friendship based on fundamentalistic understanding of the biblical texts about the blessed and chosen people of God and the Promised Land. The establishment of the State of Israel is seen as a sign from God. Therefore, a sign of faithful Christian is support to Israel and the Jews' right to the land and to a state. To deny the God-given land right and established state is to oppose the will of God. This attitude is quite common in the more conservative churches in Norway and reflected in the Christian Council. An effect of these three perspectives is that it is hard in the Christian discussion to see clear boundaries between the political motivation for supporting the project of a Jewish state and a religious and theological support based on what is seen as a role of the Jews in God's plan for salvation. The voice of the churches. The Bishops' Meeting issued in 2020 a statement condemning Christian Zionism, and the Church of Norway has since October 2023 been vocal in the public sphere. We have repeatedly condemned the terrorist attack on October 7th, called for release of the hostages, an immediate ceasefire and access to humanitarian relief. In the public conversation, few other churches have raised their voices, either in support of the Palestinian people or against the Israel warfare. The Christian Council were only able to make a statement in September 2025, and why this hesitation? The discussions indicated that what I call the Friends of Israel grouping relate to the State of Israel only as a theological concept and not to the actual state or present government of Israel. The explanation lies in their theological concepts linked to fundamentalistic reading of the Bible and an understanding that the State of Israel is a sign from God. In a survey some years ago, 90% of those who had most sympathy for the Palestinians based their support on human rights, Only 2% named biblical relevance. However, for those mainly supporting the Israeli, almost 62% stated that the support was rooted in biblical understanding. When looking into the different denominations in the Church of Norway and the Methodist Church, 70% stated human rights as most important, while in the Pentecostal and Baptist congregations, over 60% based their support to Israel on a biblical foundation. These numbers visualize how Christian Zionism helps create a theological division within the ecumenical cooperation. First, the biblical foundation for support of Israel in the ongoing conflict between Israel and Palestine is a form of Christian Zionism, either hard or mild. Secondly, I also know from the discussion with church leaders individually, I have the impression that some colleagues are cautious in their statements, if any, about Israel warfare due to fears for potential conflicts in their own constituencies. The silence from other churches, including the Roman Catholic Church in Norway, creates a mediated division between the liberal Palestinian supporting Church of Norway and the biblical Israeli supporting free churches. Yeah, that was it. Let me go back there. Summing up, we need a conversation on Christian Zionism in the public discourse on Norwegian Christianity. For the ecumenical movement in Norway, this has led to an awkward silence on the war, forfeiting both our Christian brothers and sisters in Palestine and the Palestinian people. Second, the friend of Israel opens the door for a blur between a politically acceptable Zionism from a Christianly illegitimate one. Thus, as churches, we must stand in the tradition of the ecumenical movement and speak up for human rights and international law as a theological sound instrument for coexistence. Thank you.
Thanks especially to Bishop Waite for sending his paper to be read by Bishop Sommerfeld. We also thank for the presentation. And now I just ask you to stay where you are and read your own paper.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. Yes. Do you have that PowerPoint too? There is a second one there. Yes. My theme is anti-Semitism in Christian Zionism. It has been mentioned during these days. First, on the relevance. Why should we bother, so to say? We can see clear signs that movements promoting excluding nationalism are on the offensive on all continents. One aspect of such movements is increasing discrimination against certain groups, often linked to ethnicity and or religion. One of these trends is Islamophobia, another is anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism is often linked to Christian churches' description of the Jews as a group, but also to various political movements and also in Palestinian movements. The most explicit expression in Palestinian movements is the original Hamas Charter's reference to the protocols of the learned elders of Zion, the Forge Against Alleged Jewish World Conspiracy, authored by the Tsar's secret police and considered a core anti-Semitic publication. However, anti-Semitism can also be observed among key Christian Zionist actors. It is important to highlight this, because in today's political reality, these actors constitute an important supporter of the excluding and expansionist policy of elements in the Zionist movement, and particularly in today's governing coalition in the State of Israel. Uncovering anti-Semitic elements in these actors can help to weaken their influence both on moderate supporters in the churches of the State of Israel and in Jewish movements, particularly in Europe and the USA. Linking to yesterday's point that it is actually about how to influence the movables. And in that project of influencing the movables, the documentation that Christian Zionism is anti-Semitic may help. This could in turn weaken the political basis for the political support we see for the Israeli state extreme policies in the US and in key European countries. I also need to do some conceptual clarifications, which is, of course, take some time, but I think I should do that anyway. There is an academic disagreement about anti-Semitism and Christian Zionism. I choose in this context to understand Christian Zionism as variants of an end-time focused, a specific interpretation of history, usually with apocalyptic and different variations of dispensationalism, and with a selective and literal interpretation of the Christian Bible that makes one work politically for the realization of an expansionist greater Israel. Christians who support the existence of the State of Israel are not necessarily Christian Zionists in this understanding. However, they are vulnerable to the Christian Zionist way of thinking, especially since they often see the creation of the State of Israel as proof of God's intervention in history in favor of Jews. We have not consulted each other, but you hear the same concern with Fixed Faith. The Jerusalem Declaration states that anti-Semitism is expressed in 4 basic ways: racial essentialization, anti-Semitic tropes, the various expressions of anti-Semitism in actions and discrimination, and relativization and denial of the Holocaust. Schwallenberger and Hübscher's analysis of anti-Semitism in the Alternative für Deutschland party uses what they call tertiary anti-Semitism to reveal these tendencies. Statements about Jews and the Holocaust are not expressed in overt anti-Semitism, but are indirectly associated with it. This may express a need not to be labeled as anti-Semite in the public discourse. It may seem strange to associate Christian Zionists with anti-Semitism, since they publicly appear the foremost supporters of the State of Israel and claim to be guided by the desire to comfort my people, meaning the Jews. However, it is not uncommon for anti-Semites to export Jews to Palestine in order to get rid of them in the nation state. This is known from Germany in the 30s, and I learned also from Hungary in the 50s, and the rhetoric of right-wing extremists all the time. Supporting the State of Israel as a political home for Jews, therefore, does not mean that you cannot have anti-Semitic elements in your way of thinking. Yeah, sorry, I should have moved it. No, what's happened now? Yeah, that's... So if you use the criteria for anti-Semitism on Christian Zionism, what do we get? First, racial essentialization. In Christian Zionism, the Jews, in their essence as a group, are given a specific role in the end times. This is done irrespective of which version of the end times the various Christian Zionists adhere to. This role consists of bringing about the second coming of Jesus as a prelude to the judgment of the world. Some Jews are expected to convert to the Christian faith in Jesus as a Messiah, a conversion that they believe presupposes the gathering of Jews in ancient Palestine. They imagine that a small remnant of the Jewish people, together with the true Christian believers, will be part of the rapture from the horrors of the end time. The Jews who are part of the rapture recognize Jesus as the Messiah. Other Jews will lead God's opponents as antichrist and will be sentenced to annihilation. The Jews are, as a group, an instrument in the end-time conspiracies of the Christian Zionists. This is a clear essentialization of the Jews. Second, anti-Semitic tropes. The Christian Zionists believe that the Jews have a particularly high ethical standard not least in the military. It is therefore virtually impossible for Jewish actors and a Jewish army to violate international law and commit terrorist acts. This is an often overlooked anti-Semitic trope related to the opinion that Jews are particularly rich and prosperous by virtue of being Jews. Thirdly, the various expressions of anti-Semitism, as mentioned, Christian Zionism chooses to identify with a group of Jews who promote their agenda of establishing a geographical empire in line with the promise to Abraham and Joshua, from the Mediterranean to the Euphrates and from Egypt to Turkey. The present expansion into Gaza, the West Bank and Syria, as well as Lebanon, is seen as a God-given fulfillment of the promise. Jews who do not share this view are God's adversary. They are demonized and predicted annihilation. Relativization and denial of the Holocaust. Not denial, it's relativization of the Holocaust, which is the use here. The most evident anti-Semitic tendency in Christian Zionism is the assessment of the Holocaust. Classical Christian Zionism saw the return of the Jews to the Palestine as a prerequisite for the return of Jesus. And as you know and have heard in the Balfour Declaration, the British transformed this thinking into colonial policy. But the Jews did not flock to Palestine. God therefore had to initiate strong persecution of Jews in Europe to make them realize that they had to flee to Palestine. Alternatively, the interpretation is that God punished the Jews for their disobedience by not moving to Palestine. The line of thinking must be seen as a natural consequence of the idea that God guided the establishment of the State of Israel. If God dealt with the Jews in the establishment of the State of Israel, surely God must also have directed the Holocaust. To my conclusion, Christian Zionism is a major political force in the United States, as we all know, and its significant influence in Europe and the global South, directly or indirectly. The anti-Semitic elements fuels the extreme right and their exclusive nationalist agenda against all minorities. To expose this for the movables, I think, may be a strategy to make some changes. Thank you.